Good morning, my friends. I'm glad you could be with me today in our Unfolding the Word study. Over the last several days, we've been looking at the opening verses 1 to 6 in chapter 4 of 1 Peter. And hopefully today, my intention is to finish our look at those verses so that we can then move on into the rest of the book. I want to read today from verses 3 to 6 to set the stage for our study. For the time is past, and it suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they're surprised when you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they'll give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Then this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. We've been talking about the issue of living productively or squandering our life. The issue before us is, how will you live? And for who will you live your life? And we saw the chapter began by explaining to us there is two fundamental options open to the redeemed child of God. And once again, we're talking about believers here. The first option is, as a believer, as a redeemed child of God, I am going to ultimately stay in the driver's seat of my life and live for my will. The second option is, as a redeemed child of God, I decide to live the rest of my life for the will of God. One option involves you making the choices, you sitting in the throne. The other involves letting Jesus be Lord, presenting your body as a living sacrifice. The world, in the culture in which we find ourselves, chooses as a way of life to live for self. And therefore, all of the culture works on us to try to make that normative. And many, many Christians will end up adopting that mentality. Oh, they still believe the gospel, but they pick and choose what they will let God do, what parts of their life they will give over to Him. And they stay in the throne, the control center of their life, rather than letting God be it. And God is calling for us, as Romans 12:1 puts it, to present our body as a living sacrifice. As redeemed child of God, we've been bought with a price, no longer live for ourselves, but for Him. We are not to conform to the culture's mentality about it. Now, we also began to look at some of the symptoms of this world's mentality, the symptoms that emerge of a self-controlled, self-directed life, a life that ultimately is wasted in eternal terms. We talked about how it will show up in various ways in living in sensuality. It will show up by living in passions. It will show up by living in drunkenness. It'll show up by living in orgies. And again, all of these, varying in characteristics and intensity, all reflect one who is directing their own choices in life. Now, today I want to look at the final two symptoms of that wasted life that is reflective of the world and the culture and mindset of the world we find ourselves in. The first of these we see is that we are choosing to live in drinking parties, living in drinking parties. At least that's the way the ESV translates this. Literally, it means to live driven by carousing. We've already talked about drunkenness, so the issue isn't so much drunkenness here. The issue is an individual's intemperance in general. Intemperance that shows up with excessive banqueting, the gorging of self on food and other things, gluttony, actions that are driven by satisfying the stomach, which is an image of satisfying those kinds of desires in life. A person lives to glutton and to live intemperately, to make themselves temporarily feel better by such gluttony, not just with eating food, but gluttony and intemperance, even though in the longer term, every intemperate activity ends up costing us and makes us feel bad when time passes. At any rate, that's an orientation of life. And God says that's a symptom of the world mindset that God does not want us adopting. The final one that he identifies for us, and this isn't an exhaustive list of the world's mindsets, but it's a representative one. He talks about people living in lawless idolatry, which really is a good translation here in the ESV of the idea. In the Greek, the concept is people whose spirituality is one without rules or law. In the culture that we live in today, it's not uncomfortable for people to talk about spirituality. In fact, almost everybody talks about their own spirituality and how everybody has spirituality. But they want a spirituality detached from God's revelation of his word, detached from right relationship with God in alliance with his laws. They have a worship of some sort, but it's a self-directed worship. It is one according to their intentions and guidelines. It's a idolatry without laws, a lawless idolatry. Carrying out a spiritual dimension of life, ignoring God's word, and therefore ultimately ignoring the God who is really there. This is the characteristic of the world around us. They're never threatened by an emphasis on spirituality. In fact, they encourage it. But they are automatically threatened by an emphasis on biblical truth and right relationship with the only God, the one God who is really there, and what is involved in getting into that relationship. So the issue reflects in the culture by people who are choosing to live for what they believe will give them happiness and meaning, their own spirituality, rather than living in communication and connection with the God who is really there and in line with what he's revealed to be true about himself. Now, the fact is, all of these things, all 6 of these symptoms, as we've been looking at them, reflect the mindsets and orientations that drive the culture. And once again, it doesn't matter where we are in this world. All cultures are driven and permeated by these 6 things. And one of the consequences of that is there'll be a tremendous pressure on the believer, the redeemed child of God, to align with, or at least not oppose, any of these characteristics. When we begin to live as lights in the darkness, as the chapter 2 idea and chapter 3 idea underscored for us, the fact of the matter is the world around us, those in the culture around us, simply can't understand what drives us because we seem strange to them. Remember, as the verse put it, they're surprised that you don't join with them in the same flood of debauchery. They're surprised you're not buying into the same things that motivate their lives and drive them. They're surprised by it. You seem strange to them. In fact, you make them feel uncomfortable. Why? Because your very resistance to aligning with what they're doing makes them feel guilty about what they're doing. And people hate to feel guilty. In fact, it's an accusation that they give to other people. Say, you make me feel guilty, when in point of fact, what they're doing is making them feel guilty. They can't understand what drives you. And as a result of that, they malign you, they attack you, they oppose you. They're upset that you don't join in to the mindset that they're doing. By the way, this flood of debauchery, this word translated to that, the debauchery word, is the very same word we encounter in Luke chapter 5, or chapter 15, verse 13, in description of the prodigal son, who it says it lived in wild living, is the way it translates it there. But it's the same Greek idea. In debauchery, living in alignment with all of these undergirding passions of the culture. And they abuse you and threaten you and shun you if you do not affirm those things. Now, it's interesting, after describing that to us, then the passage goes on to say, but they'll give an account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. And that's why the gospel is preached even to those who are dead. The very tension that emerges here in the world that seeks to conform us to it, that very tension proves the lostness of humanity. The gospel as we share it, shows them that they must answer to God for their life and their choices. The gospel says there is such a thing as sin. It's a real issue. It separates us from God, and it's beyond our solution. It's appointed unto man to die, and after that, to face judgment, as Hebrews 9 so graphically puts it. And the gospel is a message of hope for those that face that inevitability. The very tension of the world that seeks to conform us and pressure us is a motivation for sharing the gospel. And we proclaim with them, and we proclaim to them. Ephesians 2 says that people who are not right with God are dead spiritually. And this passage says the gospel we're sharing, we share with dead people because we don't want them to stay dead. And the gospel is the only way not to stay dead, but to find life. I think a great evangelism motto is sharing with dead people so that they might find life. Do you see the world around you that way? If I see it as dead, if I see the people living according to its standards as dead, why, as a believer, would I want to conform to the dead life? Would I not rather want to win them from death to life? Well, it's not going to happen unless, as a redeemed child of God, I am letting Jesus be Lord. Then my life can count. Well, join me again as we continue now in the 4th chapter and begin to shift to talking about an end times expectancy. Join me then, won't you? God bless.